Okay, so let us carry on with the topic of motivation to eat. And I just ate some of my beloved blue Doritos. Hope I don't have any in my teeth. So the last lecture we were talking about sensory specific satiety. And then again, since this will be a quiz question and you have to hear things 7 times, sensory specific satiety refers to when we are grown weary or when we are saturated with a specific sensory flavor. In other words, we get tired of the same flavor. This slide here is really intended to illustrate the complexity of our appetite and our eating. And again, my intention is not that you necessarily learn, all of the nuances of these things, but that you understand that it is a complicated process or that it's a complicated phenomena, and be familiar or at least have heard of the terms and the words and these things. So for instance, this image over here, which I think is more meaningful than the verbiage than the words, suggests. So it demonstrates or it illustrates how adipose, which is fat, and that's a quiz question too. What is adipose tissue? Adipose tissue is fat. That it is implicated in the level of a neurotransmitter or hormone known as leptin. So adipose releases leptin, and that influences appetite. The pancreas is implicated in the use and the excretion of insulin. And you remember, insulin is what regulates your body's ability to use glucose, which is blood sugar. And then the stomach has another neurotransmitter here, and it's implicated in ghrelin. And this is a hormone or a neurotransmitter from the stomach. So you have all 3 of these body structures, and they're all sending messages then to the brain. And then the brain is also then bombarded with sensory cues and social cues and all of these other messages that simply make eating and appetite very complicated. It's a very complicated process. So if you were to be given a multiple choice test, know that ghrelin, insulin, and leptin are all implicated in appetite, right? This is just a slide that highlights another couple terms that are important. One of them you may be familiar with, which is called BMI, Body Mass Index. And here's how you could calculate it. You take your weight in pounds, you multiply that times 703, then you square your height in inches, and then you divide the second one by the first one, and you come up with your body mass index. Your body mass index then is one way that we in our culture assess healthy body weight. A lot of it's not a good measure. There are some, it gets used a lot, but it's not necessarily the best measure to determine a healthy weight, because you might have very dense bones. You might have a lot of muscle, weighs more than fat does. So you can show up, the score is like 30 or higher, and you would officially be obese, but certainly not your body not look obese or not have excess fat. But it's just simply one way of thinking about body mass, and that's how you calculate it if you want to see what your own is. There's a couple other ways to think about weight, and they're similar. One's called the set point theory, and another one is called a settling point. But the idea is that our body kind of, that there's this place, there's this weight that we're sort of going to rest at, and we might gain a little bit, we might lose a little bit, but that's our settling point. That's the set point. It's a region, if you will. It's a range of a weight, and we're basically going to spend our whole life at that range. Here it is right here. You peak, your body weight peaks in your 6th, that'd be your 5th or your 6th, that would be your 6th decade, right, in your 50s. And then after your 50s into your 60s, your body weight actually begins to decline, and older people have a harder time keeping weight on. So like, I'm getting close to my 50s, and I'm like, I'm only going to gain so much more weight, because after you get to that decade, then because your smell diminishes, your sense of taste diminishes, and it becomes harder to keep weight on after you get to that point. But that's your settling point. This is a really important slide, because what these mice here, one of them has what's referred to as leptin resistance. It's this obese one over here. And you'll remember from 2 slides back, you have Lipton, ghrelin, and insulin. And this mouse's brain is not responding to the leptin that's being sent to it from its adipose tissue. So it just eats and eats and eats because it's got what's referred to as leptin resistance. And its body is not getting those sensory or those satiation cues to stop. And it just keeps on eating and keeps on gaining weight. That's what this one refers to. And this really, one of the, what's intended to be illustrated in this slide is that weight has a genetic component too, that because it's such a complicated phenomena, and it has brain and gut and pancreas and fat, that it is not as simple as fewer calories in, more calories out. It's just not. There's way too many forces, too many variables implicated in weight and obesity, and it is considered to be quite mysterious by researchers. My mother, I always like to say, is that my mother has always been what by the chart is considered morbidly obese, and so weight and gaining and losing has just been part of my family culture my whole life. And one thing that is true about obese people is it is the last acceptable form of discrimination. In our culture, in our country, it is completely legal to fire somebody because they're too fat, to refuse to hire somebody because they're too fat, to charge them more for goods and services because of their size. You do not have to provide services for people because of their size. It is a completely acceptable form of discrimination. And there is a terrible, terrible stigma attached to obesity where people blame the victim. And it is not that simple. It is way more complicated than that. This is an illustration. It's actually one of my favorite images that I've captured, that I've collected over the years. And when we were back in chapter 2, and we were talking about dopamine and how plasticity, brain structural plasticity, which is the phenomenon that the brain literally changes. That is kind of what's going on here. Is that we see the red, the darker colors, reflect activity to dopamine receptors, right? And you remember dopamine is the reward. Dopamine is how good something makes you feel, and it doesn't stay in the synapses very long. What you have up here is the dopamine activity of what's going to be your control brain, your normal brain, your normal person, right? And so the red indicates how much pleasure you're experiencing. Down here on the bottom is you have the brain activity of a cocaine user, and you'll notice there's less red going on in this one. Over here you have the alcoholic. They have a little bit more red, but nothing like the normal user. And up here in the right-hand corner is the obese brain. And so the contrast between the dopamine activity of the normal brain and the dopamine activity in the pleasure pathway of these other brains, and there is as little red in the obese brain as there is in the cocaine user. So it suggests that brains change, right? That obesity affects how much pleasure people get. And again, I think I would have said this in a previous lecture. The question is unclear. Does the brain change in response to obesity, or is obesity a response of the brain being different, right? So going back to these brains, did they start off like this and then cocaine changed their brain to this? Or maybe their brain has always been like this and the cocaine is because their brain isn't like that. I sure hope you see my mouse as I'm moving it around the screen, or it's not going to make any sense. So that's and of course, that would be a very unethical question, right? Let's measure your brain, let's get you hooked on Coke, and then let's see what happens to your brain. That's not an ethical question to ask. A couple really important terms on this slide that you can bet $1 they're going to show up on a test. One of them you've already seen, which is positive incentive value. That means food tastes better. So there's a lot of talk, or at least before COVID, there was a lot of talk about obesity, and it often comes back to the sedentary lifestyle. Well, I changed that. I don't think it's a sedentary lifestyle as much as it is a sedimentary culture. right? It's difficult to have a physically active lifestyle in a culture where there's no places to be physically active, where there's no sidewalks, where there's no bike paths, right? Where everything is a long ways away, and where our culture caters to cars as opposed to pedestrians. So it's not just a choice of people living a sedentary life. It's we can only create the lifestyles within the culture. We have a very sedentary culture that favors sitting and not physical activity. I mean, how many of us work in jobs where we have to sit on our butt all day, right? I commute an hour and 15 minutes to work in my car, and I come in and I sit. And then when I leave here, I get in my car and I sit and I go home and I will walk my dog, but then I sit some more. Another really important factor, and tried to emphasize this one in the previous chapter, was sleep, right? When we are stressed, when our body is expended a lot of energy, our body cannot tell the difference. All it knows is I need some energy, and it's up to us to cognitively appraise, is that energy that I need, can I recoup that if I sleep, or is the energy food, right? And in a culture where food is everywhere and sleep is discouraged because it's a sign of weakness, or I have to work and so I can't sleep, we often turn to food when really we're just tired, right? So too little sleep in our culture, and that is one of the hallmarks if you're considering dieting, to get enough rest. And consider next time you're hungry, if you can, take a nap and see if you're still hungry when you wake up. So we have cultural factors, right? We have a sedentary culture. We drive people to work and not get enough sleep. Our food tastes better. And then when we do get food, this is another really important idea right here. It's called proportion distortion. And that's what, oh gosh, I don't know how old it is, at least 10 years ago now, there was a Supersize Me. It was a expose on McDonald's, and he was making the implication that McDonald's was pushing. It was like a junk food pusher, and how you could buy more for less if you supersized. And he's the one that really coined this idea of proportion distortion. That's what's happened to our standard dietary proportions, is they've gotten larger and we haven't really noticed, right? And so what this is I think it's 20 years ago, this is the standard size of a serving. And then look at the standard size today. Muffins, I think that's a great example, right? The standard size muffin is what you make at home. They're teeny tiny, but you go to a coffee shop and you get this great big thing, and we eat it thinking that it's one serving. No, that's actually like three, right? Or what I think is interesting is I love McDonald's. I will admit it, I like McDonald's, right? But the number 9 is 2 cheeseburgers. When did 2 cheeseburgers become one serving? Right, that's a classic example of proportion distortion. One is, once upon a time. Another way you can tell how distorted your portions are is if any of you work with elderly people, right? How small their servings. That's one serving. Or if you've been a part of what's that called? Weight Watchers, right? And they teach you that a serving of meat should be the size of a deck of cards. And then you go to Five Guys and you get a whole stack of hamburger patties like this, right? Proportion distortion. That's what this is. And the servings have just gotten huger, and we count. Oh, huger. That's a good word. Oh, I have to link you up to that. It's a great documentary called Fat: What Nobody Is Telling You. And one of the things he argues in that documentary is that we eat all of this as if it's one serving, and really, in fact, it's 3. Right, but we don't think about that. We count the number of pizzas, but we don't consider how big the pizza slices are. Right, and this is related to this next really important concept, and that's called the cafeteria effect. I don't know if they do buffets anymore. There was rumor that because of COVID, buffets were going to be gone. But if the last time you went to a buffet, especially a pizza, that's a really good one that you can see this, is pizza slices on a buffet are quite small, right? And that's partly because we count the number of slices, but we're not considering the size of the slices. So the cafeteria effect says that the more choices you have, the more you will eat, right? Going back to sensory specific satiety, we get tired of one flavor. The more choices we have, the more we eat. We count, right? We're counting the number of slices, but we're not counting the size. You buy a pizza, you watch next time you go to Pizza Hut, right? If we still have Pizza Huts, right? The slices on the buffet are teeny tiny, but the slices when you buy a pizza are great big. Like what the heck? Well, they don't really want you to eat as much on the buffet, right? You buy the buffet because there's lots of choices, sensory specific satiety. They make the slices really small because they don't want you to eat as many. They give you a little bitty plate, and that's actually what this next one is. What's happened to the plate sizes, right? And what's this one? 1960s. In the 1960s, the standard plate was 8.5 inches. In 2010, it was 12 inches, right? So the smaller plates that you'll see on the buffet, they appear to be fuller. There appears to be more food, right? You go to these restaurants like Old Chicago's or something, and these plates are gigantic plates with huge portions on it. And, you know, like, whoa, we're paying a lot of money, so we need our money's worth. And we eat it all in one sitting. That is like two and a half serving sizes of food. It's no wonder we're obese, because all of this food is available. We have lots of choices. Here we go, right here. I think this is a quiz question where I ask you to offer 2 explanations of obesity, right? We have a culture that doesn't give us time to rest, right? Food is everywhere. Food tastes good. When we're given food, we're given these great big proportions. We've got lots of different choices. Oh, yeah, our culture where we don't get to walk anywhere. Some of us might be Lipton resistance. That would be like a biological or a genetic inheritance. And some of us may have inherited, you know, fewer dopamine receptors. So there's a genetic component, there's a cultural component, there's a social class component. Obesity is a very complicated phenomenon. So for exam purposes, know the cafeteria effect, know what proportion distortion means, know what positive incentive value means, be able to offer 2 specific behaviors that you could do to reduce the amount of food you eat, short of reducing the amount of food you eat. In other words, fewer choices, smaller plates, smaller sizes, right? Smaller serving sizes. And I'm going to stop this lecture right now. Thank you for listening.